Thank you, Ambassador Ford. So we'll begin with Congressman McGovern with questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It was reported this morning that UN Special Envoy Kofi Annan said President Assad has accepted his peace plan. What is the status of the talks between Annan and the Syrian government, and what are the prospects for implementing the Annan plan, and I guess what is the plan? And would it be acceptable to the United States for senior Assad government officials or military commanders to remain in power as part of a transition or a ceasefire agreement?
I have to say, Congressman, I've read the same press reports that you have this morning, but I don't have additional information beyond that. I expect we will in the coming days. If I can, I don't want to speak for Kofi Annan. He's a very respected international diplomat, but what we understand he is seeking to do, first, his mandate for the work he is doing comes off that United Nations General Assembly resolution I mentioned that had 137 votes in favor of it. That resolution calls on the Syrian forces to withdraw from cities. That resolution calls on Syrian government to release the thousands of political detainees that it holds. And that resolution calls on the Syrian government to abide by the political transition process proposed in 2 Arab League resolutions. That is what Annan is to be working for. So we will see now in the days ahead what exactly Assad has said. I have to tell you that my own experience is that with him, you want to see steps on the ground and not just take his word at face value.
Let me ask you on the, what is the United States government doing to put pressure on Russia to stop providing military aid to Syria? I mentioned in my opening remarks that my disappointment that the United States is purchasing weaponry from the Russian government, in this case, to purchase helicopters for Afghan military. It just seems to me that you mentioned China and Russia as being a problem, but other than talking to the Russians about why this is a bad thing, we end up kind of enabling them and it seems as if there's no consequence for their bad behavior. So I'm trying to figure out what are we doing, because they're going to be, if they stepped up to the plate, I think it would make a real difference here. And what additional steps could be taken to dissuade Russia from aiding the Syrian government?
Congressman, let me highlight that Secretary Clinton has had numerous conversations with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. The President spoke with Russian President Medvedev in Seoul over the weekend. And at lower levels, Assistant Secretary Feltman visited Moscow actually in January to have more technical discussions on what we believe, technical level discussions on what we believe the situation in Syria to be. We are in talking to the Russians about this constantly. Very intense effort to bring the Russians to a position where they would join a consensus among the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the P5. I would highlight here that in our discussions with the Russians, we, the Americans, we have highlighted that we are not seeking justification for military intervention. That is not our goal. Our goal is for a peaceful transition. We do not want to see a collapse of the state, and we do not want to see a civil war break out in Syria. And presumably, if the Russians share these same goals, if that is how they define their interests, then they need to help us. They need to help the United Nations Security Council. They need to help Kofi Annan to move this transition process forward. And so we will continue. I can assure you, continue working with the Russians on this.
No, and not to belabor the point, I appreciate the strong words out of the administration and the efforts to try to engage the Russians on this. But this is not the only country in the world where we're having a problem with the Russians propping up a government that has a terrible human rights record. It just seems to me that a stronger signal that might be sent right now would be to say, at a minimum, that we're not going to purchase helicopters for the Afghan military with U.S. money from the Russians, that there needs to be a consequence to this continued bad behavior. So I hope that you will bring that message back. I mean, words are one thing, and I appreciate the strong words of the administration and the efforts to negotiate, but I think that there needs to be, at this point, time has gone on. I mean, there needs to be some other kind of consequence. Just one final question. Human Rights Watch reported that the Syrian opposition has committed serious human rights violations of its own, and I want to know, is the United States taking any steps to discourage the Syrian opposition from committing such abuses?
Yes, we saw those reports, and I have to tell you, we had reports like that last year when some of the fighting in Homs became really serious. A couple of things I would say on that. We raised it even in Syria when my embassy was still open. We discussed it with some of the local Revolution Council representatives, who are themselves not members of armed groups, but certainly were in contact with them, and emphasized that they would be held to a standard on this if they wanted support from Western countries. In reaction to the latest reports that we've seen, we have raised this with the Syria National Council. And the Syria National Council last week issued a statement saying that such abuses were against what they stood for and what the Syrian protest movement, what the Syrian opposition stood for in terms of bringing change and bringing democratic transition. But this, I have to say, Congressman, this is one of our broader policy fears, is that the longer the violence continues in Syria and the worse it gets, the more we are going to see hardliners on both sides, who probably are not particular defenders of human rights, gain influence. And that is a real problem. That's why we need the transition to move forward quickly.
Well, thank you for, again, your testimony and for the way you conducted yourself as ambassador while you were there, and we really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Now, Congresswoman Waters, you have time for questions?
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. I'm going to have to leave shortly to go to the Judiciary Committee, but I want to thank again Ambassador Ford for his courageous diplomacy and leadership in Syria, and I thank him for his willingness to help educate all of us and share with us information that can be helpful to us. I too share Mr. McGovern's and Mr. Ellison's concerns about Russia and the fact that they are continuing to arm the security forces in this Assad government. And I do want to hear from you, not necessarily today, but as we continue our work about what we can do to help support the administration's position on trying to dissuade Russia from continuing to supply arms. I think that's important. I think that the approach that our government has taken and the work that you've done is extremely important, and we must listen to you, and we must show that we appreciate the knowledge that you have experienced on the ground as we move forward to try and get this peaceful resolution. What I'd like to know, without going into detail, is do you think there are other things that we can do to encourage defections from the security forces? I think that that kind of activity is extremely important in bringing down these dictators. When you get, the defections, it weakens them, and the people who are defecting have information that they can share with us. And without going into detail, do you think there's more that we can do in order to encourage defections from the security forces and sharing of information that will be helpful to weaken the Assad government?
Thank you, Congresswoman Waters. With respect to defections, we have seen reports that up to 9 Syrian security force generals have now defected. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of that because there are hundreds of generals in the Syrian forces, but I would say that we are seeing more reports over the last couple of months than we had seen during 2011. So I think that's interesting, and I think that is important. We, on our side, the United States, think that it is important also that the commanders in the Syrian forces understand that there will be accountability expected and that their actions will not be anonymous. As I said, this is not 1982 in Hama any longer. I want to say one other thing here, which is that in terms of accountability, the Syrian people themselves will be the first ones to determine accountability and how they decide to manage that, whether they use offers of immunity, for example, in order to convince people who had committed atrocities or were responsible, and then Syrian people's representatives decide that an offer of immunity to help them come out of the fight and leave the regime. I want to leave that to the Syrians, but I think creativity is going to be important if Syria is going to move forward quickly without extremists on both camps becoming more influential. For our part, Congressman, I think the best thing we can do is, and it is something we have started doing, Ambassador Stephen Rapp was just in Turkey and Jordan talking to people to see how we might be helpful in terms of helping researchers collect evidence. We have skills in that. We have experience in that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I'm curious to know your thoughts on what you think might be achieved at the Friends of Syria conference coming up on April 1st and what we might learn about human rights in the course of that conference.
Mr. Chairman, there will be several things that we hope to achieve out of the conference on among the Friends of Syria on Sunday. First, additional coordination on humanitarian assistance. The number of refugees is still growing. We estimate now that about 230 to 250,000 Syrians have been displaced from their homes because of the fighting. Approximately 35,000 are outside of Syria in refugee camps in places like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and even some in Iraq. And then the remainder, over 200,000, probably are inside Syria still, but in many cases in desperate situations. And so we have increased our assistance through the United States Agency for International Development, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and also the State Department's Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau. But other countries need to help in that effort too, and some are, especially partners in places such as Europe. But that'll be a big agenda item. Second, we will certainly discuss additional measures to further isolate the regime, and so I think there'll be a discussion of sanctions and existing sanctions. The Arab League has announced that its members should implement sanctions, and we will certainly want to talk to the Arab countries about how they are implementing sanctions and if there are ways we can coordinate and cooperate on sanctions. And finally, we will want to talk also to the Syrian opposition itself to hear what they are doing in terms of planning for a transition, what they are doing to build this vision that I mentioned that unites Syrians and brings Syrians together. The Syrian opposition has a huge role in this process as well.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm curious to know what should or could the United States Congress be doing that we're not doing? What is needed of us? I have a resolution supporting the democratic process that is trying to take hold in Syria. What in your view should or could we be doing that we're not doing?
Congressman, I think the resolutions that have come from the Congress already are very helpful in terms of they do two things. First, they give hope to the people inside Syria who are really quite well informed about what's going on around the world. They're satellite television networks that cover news out of Washington extensively. I had about 300 Arabic language television stations on my TV in Damascus. It's quite remarkable how many Arabic language stations there are now. So they're very well informed, and they know what the Congress is doing and what they're saying. I'm sure news about this hearing will be in Damascus tonight. So I would encourage these kinds of things to spotlight attention. Second, they reinforce our efforts in the State Department and on the diplomatic side as we try to convince other countries, Russia and others, that this is the way to go, and that the United States is unified in its vision about the problem and how to address it. I would like to make a pitch, Congressman, if I may, in Secretary Clinton's budget request. She did highlight the establishment of a Middle East response fund. And when the democratic transition comes to Syria, and I emphasize the word when, I think the fall of this regime is inevitable. I hope sooner, not later. It would be far less damaging to the country and far less bloodshed were it sooner, but it will come. And I am sure that we will want to talk to the new Syrian government about promoting democracy, about promoting reconciliation, promoting accountability. And we will need tools with which to do that, Mr. Chairman, and something like the Middle East Response Fund might give us those tools.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, given the time, unfortunately, we can't ask all the questions you'd like to ask you, but we will contact you, and perhaps you can brief us in a future date. But please let it be known that we appreciate and respect the work you've done. And in your communications with Syrians, please let them know that we do care about the situation in Syria. It is our concern and want to help in any constructive way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.